Joy 94.9.
Welcome to the Rainbow Report. News, opinion, current affairs for the rainbow community from Joy 94.9. Australia's only full-time gay and lesbian radio station. And now your host, Doug Pollard.
News and interviews. Joy 94.9.
Well, thanks, Chris and Cam, for your Drive Factory. Good evening. Welcome to the Rainbow Report. We're talking about how far we've come and where we've still to get to. In the past, we were often airbrushed out of history, but now we're doing our best to make sure we are recorded on history's page at every stage, as the national anthem says. This week saw the launch of a new Facebook page chronicling the genesis of England's first national gay newspaper, Gay News. Now, those of you who know me little will know I find this exciting because I was one of the founders of that paper back in 1972. Bunch of the guys, some who have been involved in it over its long history, have started a Facebook page and a YouTube channel chronicling the story of the paper. Tonight we'll talk to one of them, former assistant editor of the paper, Keith Howes. And I'm very pleased to see that people are now making an effort to preserve the history of the paper, and a very interesting Facebook page has popped up, and there's a YouTube channel as well. If you're interested, there are links on my programme blog. That's joy.org.au/Rainbow Report, and you can go and have a look. My next guest was assistant editor of the paper from 1976, and his name is Keith Howes. Good evening, Keith.
Good evening, Doug.
Well, are you pleased to see the history of the paper coming alive?
Well, I think, as was said in Australia in 1972, it's time. It's 40 years on, and I was just concerned that nothing was being said about a paper that was much loved and sometimes hated, controversial, but also enormously impressive and effective in communicating with gay and lesbian people all over the British Isles, and indeed, outside Britain as well, during the late 1970s and early 1980s, when I was involved.
Yeah, I think one of the things most people remember about Gay News, if they remember anything, is the prosecution for blasphemous libel when the head of the Festival of Light, that was the English equivalent of the Australian Christian lobby at the time, Mrs. Mary Whitehouse, brought a private prosecution against the paper and the editor. And she actually succeeded in one sense, in that she won the case. But I think that made the paper, didn't it?
It certainly drew a lot of attention to the paper. It was even mentioned in Time magazine. It became, had its 15 minutes of fame. It was notorious, and it certainly brought many more readers, both gay and non-gay, to the paper. And for a short while, we were the centre of attention. But it didn't do us any good in the long run, because our editor, I think, became somewhat infatuated with fame, and eventually the paper was sold, and after about 2 years it collapsed in early 1983, which is a source of great sadness to me, because I think that it was a unique publication, and in a way it's just as needed now as it was back in the 1970s and early 80s.
Yes, Rod Swift, do you want to come in here?
Yeah, I do. Do you think that the papers, and I'm thinking also some of the Australian papers we had here, and with the campaign against moral persecution here down under, do you think that the papers of the 70s and the 80s had that edge, that sort of social conscience, that because of course it wasn't commercially driven back then, but more human rights driven, I would say, compared to now?
I think it was because it was very much involved with gay liberation, the short-lived but very powerful gay liberation front, and it was working on so many different levels, wasn't it? Because it was trying to connect with so many human rights groups and liberation areas, black rights, women's rights, etc., abortion rights. So it was much more, it was wider, it was broader, and it was political.
Do you think also that nowadays the more, or I'll say the modern media in the gay world has lost that touch with like parallel issues with things like abortion rights, with things like that? Yeah,
I don't want to sound like a grumpy old man, because
well, you can.
I think that I think that every decade brings its own effective medium for whatever group of people it's aiming at, and I'm thrilled to see that gay publications, gay blogs, gay TV programs are now so much more colourful and lively, and they do deal with very serious issues. Television and the way it treats gays is fantastic compared to 40 years ago. Really good. It's interesting that movies have very few characters now, gay.
Yes, well, a lot of gay actors, but we don't know about them, do we?
Well, we know a little bit more than we did 40 years ago.
A little bit.
40 years ago, Ian McKellen wasn't out of the closet.
True.
Now in a big way.
Yes, he is. Well, thinking back to GLF days, of course, I was there right at the very beginning. I was actually involved in the so-called editorial collective that GLF and the Campaign for Homosexual Equality put together in order to launch the paper, and it was meant to be a collaboration between those two. And there were a couple of things there that have completely changed from those days. One was that we had this very strong ethos that we would not accept advertising from commercial gay organisations like pubs and clubs and those sort of things. They were seen as being exploitative, and therefore they were not allowed to advertise originally. And they, in fact, in the early days in London, they weren't even allowed to join in the Pride March. I think that's been the big change, that the commercialisation of the scene, and also the fact that now most of these commercial businesses are gay-owned and run, which they weren't then.
Yes, I think it was very much, okay, business is bad on a Monday night, so let's just shove in a gay night. And that was simply not acceptable. But the thing is, what was the alternative in those days? If people were going to go out and meet other people and dance, surely it was preferable to go there than to go to a park or a toilet where it was dangerous, etc., etc. Whereas, of course, now, as you say, most of the businesses are gay-owned, which is terrific. One of the differences I noticed when I worked for Gay News was that when we used to go to gay pubs and clubs all over Britain, and we used to say to people, okay, we're going to take a photograph on the dance floor would clear couples. Now you have to fight them off.
Yeah, well, I remember when we first started the paper, we used to actually, all members of the collective used to take a big satchel full of copies round the gay bars in London, and a lot of them would not allow us to sell the paper inside the bar. They didn't like us being there.
Well,
and it was
the tone, didn't it?
It wasn't just the management. It wasn't just the management, it was the people as well. They were saying, oh, no, we don't want you, we don't want people to know we're here.
Certainly one of the biggest obstacles I always found working for the paper were very closeted gay people, particularly gay men.
Yes.
Because they knew all the defences. They'd been trained by masters over the years to hide and feel self-hatred, and they were very difficult to deal with.
Yes, I remember on one occasion, I think it was outside the Coleherne, which became something of an iconic pub.
Certainly did.
But I remember outside the Coleherne when we were conducting sales outside there, people throwing bottles at us.
Good gracious.
You know, so things have changed an awful lot since those days.
Yeah, well, because the paper used to receive sort of obscene phone calls practically every day. You know, we just got so used to that because it was in the telephone book as gay news, and in those days, you know, the word gay was really a red rag to a bull. It was very shocking. The paper was really regarded as almost like a terrorist publication.
Yeah, it was. Well, I suppose because we were tangled up with GLF, and a lot of people were very frightened of GLF, because GLF laid the stress not on lobbying, but on something we seem to have forgotten how to do, certainly here in Australia, and that's direct action.
Yeah, the ZAP and street theatre, that was very much part of GLF, wasn't it? It had real flair, and of course lots of anger was fueling it, and it was young.
Yes.
It was young. It was full of very early 20-year-olds.
Of which I was one.
I know.
I think one of my favourite ones was when this book came out called Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Sex But Were Afraid to Ask. David Rubin. And Martin Corbett, who'd been one of the original members of Gay News, although he wasn't with them anymore. He was so outraged by this publication. It had his chapter on homosexuality, which went on at great length about gay men shoving vegetables up their bottoms. So he constructed a 12-foot-long cucumber and delivered it to the publisher's offices with much resultant publicity.
Yeah. There was
there was wit and humour in that.
Yeah, there was a lot of that, wasn't there, in the early days of GLF, and it was much appreciated by a small group of people, but I think it did scare a lot of more conservative gays off.
Well, yeah, but it did get things done. It did get things done, and people followed on from there. Keith, you interviewed an awful lot of people in your time at the paper, didn't you? Who was probably your most memorable?
I would think that one of them would have been Angela Badley, who was the character Mrs. Bridges in Upstairs Downstairs. She was actually my first interview for Gay News. She didn't know what the paper was, and when I told her, she said, "But I thought it was a paper for happy people." She was most shocked. Anyway, the poor lady died in her sleep, I may say, that weekend. So my first article for Gay News was published posthumously.
That would tend to make it stick in your mind. Was there any particularly really, really difficult interview you did?
Very difficult. Well, there was one with a diva whose name I refuse to say. She turned out to be extremely homophobic, and luckily she was homophobic in Time magazine as well, and so we cancelled the interview. We just didn't go through with printing it because it was quite offensive. But yeah, some people were difficult, but in the main, because it was Gay News, and because they agreed to be interviewed by Gay News, they were, I think, perhaps more thinking people in the first place.
And most of them, unlike Angela Badley, didn't know who they were talking to.
Well, I think she absolutely knew what the paper was all about, but she had to go through the motions of being shocked.
Oh, dear. Those were the days.
And
okay.
When I interviewed Brian Derbyshire he was the king of S&M.
Oh, yes, dear Beryl, yes.
And I interviewed him in the Coleherne pub, and he went through all the various stages of S&M sex, including using the code word Oklahoma at the more rugged parts of the act. And when my mother read this interview, she said, but this is disgusting. What are you promoting? So when I told Dennis Lemon, our editor, he rang my mother up, and as he did with so many people, charmed her to total submission, and after that, him, and the paper could do no wrong.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there.
I must say to people, look, if they want to read, they want to look at these little interviews that we've done. It's Gay News, Keith Howes, Howes, or Gay News UK, Keith Howes, Howes, and we've done 24 YouTube videos about the paper and all its content.
Yep, and I've put a link to all those on my blog for the programme, joy.org.au/Rainbow Report. Keith Howes, thank you very much.
To talk to you, Doug. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.
This Joycast is a free service brought to you by Joy 94.9. Support Joy 94.9 by becoming a member at joy.org.au.